And God said, this is my anointed. As I mentioned before, I should also address another one. God hasn't chosen Trump also because he's the one with biblical values. Because then again, you're assuming that God always wants the candidate with biblical values to be president, which is wrong. It can be God's will, and it has in the past been God's will for the person with ungodly values to be in power. He told Pharaoh, for this cause have I raised you up. He knows Pharaoh is resistant to the will of God, but he used Pharaoh's resistance to God to establish miracles in Egypt. So again, God can use the wicked to establish righteousness, or use the wicked and put the wicked in a position of power so the wicked can do wicked things that God will use to bring about righteousness. So this isn't the typical, oh, I'm a Christian, so I have to vote for Trump because he's a conservative or a Republican, and every Christian has to vote. It's not about vote Trump because Republican, or vote Trump because conservative, or vote Trump because of values. Because voting according to your values, even though it sounds good in the flesh, is actually carnal. Why? Because it can, what happens if God now says, even though Kamala Harris right now is fighting against my values and fighting against my principles, vote for her, because once she gets into power, I will change her heart. For the Bible says that the heart of a king is in the hands of Yahweh, and he can turn it whithersoever he pleases. That means God can change the character of a king. God can say to the church, vote for Kamala Harris. I know that her values are against my principles, but when she gets into power, I'll change her heart and she'll begin to fight for righteousness. At that point, now the church has to vote for Kamala, even though her values, face value, are against God. But see, that wouldn't be an intellectual decision, because being spiritual and being intellectual are two different things. Saying vote according to your values sounds smart intellectually, but it's not spiritual, because it becomes a problem if God now tells us to vote for the person that doesn't have our values, because he knows that in the future this person's heart will change. The rational decision is not always the spiritual decision. God told Abraham's son Isaac to stay and sow in a famine, and then he reaped 100-fold in that same year. That's not a rational decision. How do you sow seed in a famine? That's not intelligent. There's nothing intelligent about that in the natural, but it is spiritual, because to be spiritual means to be led by the Spirit. So what is spiritual may not always be sensible in the natural realm, but that's a sensible postulation. Oh, vote for the person with your values. Not necessarily. Vote for the will of God. That's who you're supposed to vote for, the one that God says to vote for. Even if you think you shouldn't vote for that person, even if you think that person's values doesn't align, even if that person is not a Republican or not a Democrat, whatever, you can't create your own metrics to then use to vote. You're in the flesh, and you might find yourself fighting against God. You're not the one to define the metrics of your voting. God's voice defines the metrics of it. That's what it means to be spiritual. You're led by God, even if what he's leading you to do doesn't sound rational. God told a prophet, to walk around naked for a year. Does that sound like it makes sense? If I came and I said I'm a prophet, God told me to walk around naked for a year, 99% of Christians will say it's a demon, because it doesn't sound like it makes sense. Why is God telling somebody to be naked? And they'll say, no, he just did it as a typology. It doesn't matter. He's still a human being that God told to do it. Christians like to do this thing where if God gives a prophet in the Old Testament an instruction that's unsensible, they'll say, all right, but it will never happen again because it was just a figure of speech. You can say what you want. We say it as if these men aren't human beings. It's an actual literal human that God literally told to literally walk around naked for a literal year. He told him to do it. So what that establishes, that God can give people instructions, again, like I'm saying, that don't make sense to the flesh, that make it seem like, but how can God tell somebody to walk around naked? This is why Paul calls God's will a mystery. God's will isn't as simple as people think it is. It's not always that simple. Of God's will always has to be sensible, or God's will has to always be for the good outcome to be produced. No.